My name is Hannah Brooks. I am 33 years old, and the night my life split cleanly in two did not begin with screaming or sirens. It began with a doorbell I almost ignored. I had just gotten home, kicked off my shoes, and was halfway through reheating leftovers when it rang a second time. Longer this time, like whoever stood outside had no intention of leaving. When I opened the door, there was no one on my porch. Just a car seat, a diaper bag, and a baby boy sleeping under a thin blue blanket like someone had dropped off a package they did not want to sign for. Tucked beside him was a folded note with 7 words that made my hands go cold. His name is Noah. I cannot do this. I knew exactly who had written it. I also knew, before I even picked up my phone, that the people who should have helped me would not. I called my parents first anyway, because panic makes you hope against your own memory. My mother barely let me finish before she said, "He is yours now." Then my father got on the line and told me not to drag them into another one of my brother's disasters. Just like that, a 3-month-old baby was left on my doorstep. My own family washed their hands of him, and somehow I was the only one standing there like this child was a human life instead of an inconvenience. I did not know then that 10 years later, those same people would march into a courtroom, point at me like I was the thief, and try to take him back. But the moment I lifted that baby out of the car seat and he curled his tiny hand around my finger, something in me made a promise the rest of my life would have to keep. Before I tell you what happened when they came back for him a decade later, tell me this: what time is it where you are right now? And where are you listening from tonight? I really want to see how far this story reaches. That first night was a blur of fear, formula, and Google searches I never wanted to make. I drove to a 24-hour grocery store still wearing my work clothes, standing in the baby aisle with my phone in one hand and the cart in the other, trying to figure out what kind of formula a 3-month-old needed and what size diapers to buy when you had never changed one in your life. A woman old enough to be my grandmother helped me without asking too many questions. She just looked at the baby, looked at my face, and started placing the right things in my cart like she had seen panic before, and knew kindness worked better than pity. By the time I got home, Noah was awake and crying so hard his whole little body shook. I fed him with trembling hands, laid him down in a dresser drawer lined with folded blankets because I had nothing else, and sat on the floor beside him until dawn, too scared to sleep in case he stopped breathing. The next morning, I called the school district and said I had a family emergency. At the time, I worked as a speech therapist for an elementary school in a suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, and I had never once asked for emergency leave. My supervisor heard something in my voice and told me to take the week. After that, I filed a police report, called a family lawyer, and learned exactly how messy it was to become the emergency guardian of a child who had been dumped on you by blood and abandoned by everyone else. My brother Dylan had always been reckless, selfish, and impossible to count on, but this was a level even I had never imagined. His girlfriend had vanished a few weeks after giving birth, according to the little scraps of truth I could piece together. And because Dylan was the only legal parent left on paper, he had apparently decided the easiest way to survive his own collapse was to hand his son to me and disappear. My parents, Elaine and Victor Brooks, treated the whole thing like an embarrassment they hoped would stay off their street and out of church gossip. They did not ask if Noah had eaten. They did not ask if I had slept. They only repeated that they were done rescuing Dylan from his own decisions. My boyfriend at the time, Evan, turned out to be just as hollow. He came over that second night, looked at the crib I had borrowed, the unopened diaper boxes stacked in my living room, and told me this situation was not what he signed up for. When I asked whether he could at least stay for an hour so I could shower, he said I was letting my family ruin my life all over again. I broke up with him before he even reached the parking lot. The next 2 weeks changed everything. I filled out guardianship papers, I borrowed money, I moved from my one-bedroom apartment into a tiny two-bedroom rental I could barely afford because I could not keep a baby sleeping in a dresser drawer forever. My next-door neighbor, Mrs. Delaney, became the first person in months who made me feel like I was not drowning. She was a retired librarian with silver hair and a voice that could calm storms, and when she found out I was suddenly caring for an infant alone, she walked into my kitchen with casseroles, burp cloths, and the kind of steady practical help family is supposed to offer. My coworkers gathered hand-me-downs, baby bottles, and a secondhand crib. Little by little, Noah stopped feeling like a crisis I was surviving minute by minute, and started feeling like a child whose rhythms I was learning. I learned the sound of his hungry cry, the sound of his sleepy cry, the way he liked to have his back rubbed after a bottle, the way his tiny fist would uncurl when he finally relaxed against my shoulder. And somewhere between the midnight feedings and the paperwork, and the terror of realizing nobody was coming to help me, my anger began changing shape. I was still furious at Dylan. I was still disgusted by my parents. But every time Noah looked up at me with those serious, dark eyes, I felt something stronger than anger. I felt responsibility turning into love. On his first birthday, I invited the few people who had actually shown up for us. Mrs. Delaney baked a simple cake with blue frosting. My coworkers brought balloons and cheap paper decorations. Noah smashed frosting into his own hair and laughed so hard he hiccuped. I remember standing there in my tiny kitchen, looking at the mess and the smiles and that baby I had once found on my doorstep, and realizing there was no part of me that thought of him as temporary anymore. He was not my brother's burden. He was my son in every way that mattered, even if the law had not fully caught up to my heart yet. The first 5 years with Noah passed the way the important years usually do, slowly while you are living them and all at once when you look back. He grew from a baby who clung to my shirt into a little boy who ran ahead of me at the park and then turned every few seconds just to make sure I was still there. I built my whole life around stability because I understood, even before he had words for it, that children who come into the world through chaos need predictability the way other children need bedtime stories. So I gave him both. I rearranged my work schedule and eventually transferred into a district-wide role that let me spend more consistent hours close to home. Our weeks developed a rhythm that belonged only to us. Friday nights were grilled cheese and movie night on the couch. Saturday mornings were soccer in the backyard, or pancakes shaped like dinosaurs when the weather turned cold. Sunday afternoons meant library trips, grocery shopping, and Noah pushing the little cart like he was contributing something important to the household budget. He had a stuffed bear named Captain and a habit of asking impossible questions right before bedtime. Where does the wind sleep? Why do grown-ups cry in bathrooms? If trees are alive, do they get lonely in winter? There were hard years in those first 5, too. Money stayed tight. I took on private speech tutoring online after Noah fell asleep so I could keep up with rent and build a savings account with his name on it. When he got sick, I sat up through fevers and ear infections alone. When I got sick, I still made breakfast, packed lunches, and showed up for him because there was no one to hand him off to. My parents visited only when it was convenient for them, and even then they came carrying the same judgment they had given me from the start. My mother would bring gifts that had nothing to do with who Noah actually was, as if she liked the idea of grandmother more than the actual child standing in front of her. My father kept his distance physically and emotionally, asking stiff questions about school and then glancing around my house like he was measuring all the ways I had failed to become the daughter he once imagined. Noah sensed it before he could explain it. He was chatty and fearless with almost everyone, but around my parents he turned quiet, careful, as if even then some part of him knew their love came with conditions. By the time he was old enough to ask about where he came from, I had already promised myself I would never poison him with my bitterness. So I told him the truth in pieces he could carry. I told him his father was my brother. I told him that when Noah was a baby, his dad was not capable of taking care of him. I told him some people can love a child and still fail them, and that failure always belongs to the grown-up, never the child. What I did not do was lie to make other people look better. When Noah asked if his dad would ever come back, I told him I did not know. When he asked why his grandparents barely visited, I said some adults do not know how to love the right way. When he asked if I was really his mom, it happened so casually that for a second I thought I had imagined it. He was 5, standing at the sink in dinosaur pajamas while I packed his lunch for kindergarten. He dropped a grape, looked up at me, and said, "Mom, can I have the blue cup instead?" The whole room went still inside me. I did not make a big speech or ask him to repeat it. I just handed him the blue cup and said, "Of course you can." Later that night, after he fell asleep with one sock missing and Captain wedged under his chin, I sat beside his bed and cried quietly into my hands. Not because the word surprised me, but because it felt like a truth my life had been walking toward for years. From then on, it came naturally. Mom at the grocery store, Mom from the back seat. Mom whispered through fevers and nightmares. He never used my first name again. We took our first real trip together when he was 6, a modest drive up toward Lake Erie with cheap motel sheets, sticky boardwalk fries, and enough laughter to make me forget how carefully I had budgeted every dollar. He collected smooth stones from the water. I collected the sight of him running toward me at sunset, all skinny legs and trust. By the time Noah turned 8, the people who truly made up our family were not the ones connected to us by blood. They were Mrs. Delaney, my friend Tasha from work, Noah's second-grade teacher who saved every one of his drawings, the soccer dad who fixed my dead battery in a rainstorm, the woman at the bakery who always slipped an extra cookie into Noah's birthday box. Our family had been built the hard way, through consistency and care. It did not look traditional, but it was strong, and for a long time I let myself believe that strength would be enough to protect us from the people who had once walked away. Noah was 9 when the past came back, wearing a calm voice and a pressed button-down shirt. It was a Tuesday evening in early fall. I was helping him build a solar system model at the kitchen table when my phone rang from an unknown number. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something in me tightened before I even answered. The voice on the other end was older, flatter, and far more controlled than the one I remembered. But I knew it immediately. It was Dylan. For a second, I could not speak. He filled the silence by telling me he had been sober for years, that he had finally gotten his life together, that he was married now to a woman named Caroline, and that he wanted a chance to do the right thing with his son. "My son," I almost said. Instead, I stepped into the hallway and asked the first question that mattered. "Why now?" Dylan gave me the kind of answer people give when they have rehearsed something in the mirror. He said he had needed time to become stable. He said he had carried shame every day. He said he wanted to rebuild slowly, respectfully, without causing harm. I hated how reasonable he sounded. I hated even more that a small part of me wanted to believe him for Noah's sake. After I hung up, I spent half the night staring at the ceiling and the other half researching child psychologists, because I knew I could not make a decision like that from fear alone. The psychologist I found told me what I already knew in my gut. If Dylan re-entered Noah's life, it had to happen gradually, under supervision, and always on Noah's emotional timeline, not Dylan's. So that is how it began. The first meeting took place at a science museum on a Saturday afternoon. I told Noah the truth in the gentlest language I could manage. I said his dad wanted to meet him. Noah went very quiet and asked whether that meant he had done something wrong. That question broke me in a place I never fully recovered from. At the museum, Dylan arrived with Caroline, and the first thing I noticed was how polished they both looked. Dylan had cut his hair. He wore a watch that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Caroline was warm, elegant, and almost too perfect in the way she crouched to Noah's level, and told him she had heard he loved planets. She handed him a small telescope like she had spent weeks thinking about what kind of gift would make her seem thoughtful without appearing desperate. For the first few visits, everything stayed careful and polite. Dylan did not push. Caroline smiled at the right moments. Noah mostly stayed close to me, answering questions in short sentences, watching Dylan with the kind of caution children learn when grown-ups have disappointed them before they are old enough to spell the word. Over time, though, he relaxed just enough to ask Dylan why he had not been around. Dylan said he had been sick and had needed to get better. It was not a lie exactly, but it was nowhere near the whole truth. I watched that answer land on Noah's face and felt the first real thread of danger slide under my skin. After a few months, Dylan and Caroline announced they were moving to Columbus permanently. They said they wanted to be closer to Noah and build something real. Again, reasonable. Again, polished. Again, everything about it felt just slightly too smooth. They started showing up more often. They learned Noah's favorite foods. They came to one of his soccer games and cheered louder than people who had earned that right. Caroline took pictures and called him a natural. Dylan talked about how much he had missed and how grateful he was that I had stepped in when he could not. The gratitude would have softened me if it had stayed gratitude. It did not. It turned, little by little, into implication. Caroline mentioned the better school district near their neighborhood. Dylan pointed out that Noah would love having his own yard. One evening over dinner at my house, after Noah had run off to get a drawing he wanted to show Caroline, Dylan leaned back in his chair and said the sentence I had been fearing without wanting to name. He said, "He deserves the chance to be with his real family now." I stared at him so hard I think even he felt ashamed for half a second. Then Caroline, still smiling in that controlled way of hers, added that what they meant was a traditional home, 2 parents, more financial security, more opportunities, the sort of life Noah would naturally benefit from. It was one of the cruelest conversations I have ever survived because they dressed the insult in gratitude. They praised me like a substitute teacher who had done an admirable job keeping a seat warm. They talked about my sacrifices while quietly erasing my claim to them. I kept my voice low because Noah was in the next room, and I would have swallowed glass before letting him hear panic in mine. I told them Noah already had stability. I told them I was not interested in discussing a custody change. Dylan looked almost offended, as if I were the one behaving unreasonably. That was the night I stopped seeing his return as a messy attempt at redemption and started recognizing it for what it really was. He had not come back to know Noah. He had come back to reclaim something he thought would be easy to take once it had been lovingly repaired by someone else. The dinner at my parents' house confirmed every fear I had tried to dismiss. They invited Noah and me over on a Sunday, which was unusual enough to make me suspicious before I even pulled into the driveway. When we walked in, Dylan and Caroline were already there, sitting comfortably in the living room like they had been restored to their rightful places. My mother actually looked pleased to see all of us under one roof, which might have moved me if I had not known exactly how absent she had been through the years that mattered. Dinner was stiff from the beginning. Noah sensed something was off and stayed close to me, answering questions politely but without his usual spark. After dessert, my father cleared his throat in the formal way he always did before saying something that would wound someone, and then pretending he had no idea why they bled. He said Dylan had told them everything, that they were proud of how hard he had worked to rebuild his life, and that it was time for me to think about what was best for Noah instead of what was comfortable for me. I asked one question: "How long have you been in contact with him?" My mother and father exchanged the kind of glance that says the lie has already been discussed but not fully rehearsed. Finally, my mother admitted they had been speaking to Dylan for almost 4 years. 4 years. 4 years they had known where he was. 4 years of birthdays, school plays, fevers, soccer games, spelling tests, and nightmares. And not once had they thought I deserved the truth. Not once had they thought Noah deserved honesty about the father who had left him. They had simply chosen silence until Dylan had a wife, a decent suit, and a story that was easier to defend in public. Then came the line I should have expected but still felt like a slap. "Blood is blood," my father said. "Noah belongs with his father now that his father can provide a proper home." My mother chimed in with talk about two-parent households, structure, real family, all the old poison dressed up as common sense. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. Noah looked at me, startled. On the drive home, he was quieter than I had ever heard him. We had barely turned onto our street when he asked in a small voice if he was going to have to move away with Dylan. I pulled over because there was no universe in which I could answer that while driving. I unbuckled, turned to him, and told him the truth as cleanly as I could. I said no one was taking him anywhere. I said he was home with me. I said grown-ups were saying things they should not have said in front of him, and I was sorry. He nodded. But that night he had a nightmare so violent I found him half out of bed, crying in his sleep and clutching the blanket with both fists. 3 weeks later, the certified envelope arrived. Dylan had filed to regain primary custody. He claimed he had recovered, reformed, and was now in the best position to raise his son. He claimed I had interfered with his attempts to reconnect. He claimed I had emotionally alienated Noah from his biological family. My parents submitted sworn statements backing him up. According to their affidavits, I had spent years blocking healthy contact, refusing invitations, and presenting myself as Noah's only parent out of selfishness. I had read enough lies by that point to know the real danger was not in their cruelty, but in how official cruelty can look when typed on legal paper. I hired Rebecca Sloan within 48 hours. She was a family law attorney with sharp eyes, a calm voice, and the kind of mind that made me feel less alone the second she started asking questions. She read every document, every message, every school record I brought her, then folded her hands and told me the truth without trying to soften it. Dylan's biological tie mattered. Courts often gave weight to that, especially when the returning parent could present sobriety, income, and a home. But she also told me something that kept me breathing. 10 years mattered too. My decade of daily parenting mattered. Noah's bond to me mattered. Stability mattered. She told me to start gathering everything: school records, medical records, teacher emails, photos, calendars, text messages with my parents. Anything that showed the truth of how Noah had actually been raised and how absent everyone else had been. So I did. I built binders while Noah slept. I printed report cards with my signature on every form. I collected doctor visit summaries listing me as parent or guardian. I asked teachers, coaches, neighbors, and Mrs. Delaney to write statements describing the life Noah actually lived. The more evidence I gathered, the clearer one thing became. This was not a misunderstanding. It was an organized attempt to rewrite 10 years of history in a way that made Dylan look redeemed, my parents look concerned, and me look possessive. What they had not counted on was how many receipts a woman accumulates when she raises a child alone and learns early that nobody else will remember the truth unless she keeps it herself. As the court date got closer, the case stopped being something that lived in folders and started affecting the air inside my house. Noah became jumpier. He asked whether judges could make kids leave the people they loved. He started having trouble sleeping. His teacher called to tell me he had cried in class when another student mentioned moving homes after a divorce. I got him into therapy with a child psychologist who specialized in attachment and family disruption, and even though every part of me hated that he needed that kind of help because grown-ups had failed him again, I was grateful for someone who knew how to translate his fear into language a court might respect. His therapist documented what I already knew in my bones. Noah saw me as his primary parent. The threat of being separated from me was causing real anxiety. He was not conflicted about where he felt safe. He was terrified that adults would ignore it. Meanwhile, Rebecca and I kept building the case. We documented every year Dylan had been absent. Every time my parents had declined invitations or canceled visits. Every message where my mother criticized my choices without offering support. Every time my father referred to Noah as a situation instead of a child. I also hired a private investigator, not because I wanted dirt, but because timing matters, and Dylan's sudden urgency after 10 years felt less like love than strategy. The investigator found the first crack almost immediately. Dylan was not as stable as he claimed. He had been sober, yes, and I will give truth credit where it belongs. But sobriety was not the same thing as integrity. He was buried under gambling debt from sports betting accounts opened under his own name and one in a business alias he thought was harder to trace. Large withdrawals, late payments, quiet settlements. The pattern was ugly, desperate, and recent. Then came the second discovery, and that one shifted the whole shape of the case. Caroline was not simply a supportive wife trying to help her husband reconnect with his son. Through emails, text messages, and a series of carefully cheerful notes she had sent to a colleague, the investigator found repeated references to Noah as the missing piece. At first, that phrase meant nothing. Then it became everything. Caroline worked in luxury real estate branding, and she was in the running for a high-profile partnership that favored candidates with polished, family-centered public images. More importantly, she had access to a housing trust connected to her late grandfather's estate, and one of the discretionary benefits tied to that trust involved subsidized access to a restored family property for descendants building long-term households. It was not as simple as a cartoon villain twirling a mustache over a pile of money, but it was worse in a more human way. Noah was not a child to them. He was proof of something marketable. He was a symbol they could stand beside in photos. He was legitimacy. He was leverage. The investigator also uncovered months of planning between Dylan and my parents. Group messages, calls, calendars, discussions about judges, impressions, and how to frame me as controlling. In one message, my mother actually wrote that if Noah kept calling me mom in public, it would make everything harder, and my father replied that children adjust faster than women who get too attached. I sat at my kitchen table reading that exchange while Noah slept down the hall and had to press my palm flat against the wood to keep from throwing up. Rebecca did not react dramatically when I handed her the new material. She just went very still in the way competent people do when they realize the truth is even uglier than expected. We organized everything into a sealed evidentiary packet. The financial records, the communications, the contradictions between Dylan's court filings and his actual debt. The messages showing my parents had maintained secret contact for years while letting me believe they knew nothing. The notes indicating Caroline and Dylan had discussed when Noah would be old enough to present well in court without being difficult to manage. That line in particular made Rebecca look up and say, very quietly, "They are going to regret putting this in writing." The night before the hearing, Noah fell asleep on the couch while pretending he was not tired. His math workbook was open beside him, one sock half off, his hair falling across his forehead in the exact way it had when he was a baby. I carried him to bed, tucked the blanket under his chin, and stood there longer than I should have. I thought about the first night I found him on my doorstep. I thought about every promise I had made since. Then I walked into the kitchen, saw the sealed folder on the table, and felt something settle inside me. Fear was still there. So was anger. But underneath both was certainty. They had come for my son with rehearsed smiles, polished lies, and the belief that biology plus performance would outweigh a decade of love. The next morning, they were going to learn what happens when the woman they underestimated stops playing defense. The courtroom was colder than I expected and quieter than it should have been for a room about to decide the shape of a child's life. Dylan arrived in a navy suit with Caroline beside him, looking composed enough for a magazine profile on Second Chances. My parents sat directly behind them, dressed like the kind of respectable older couple judges were supposed to trust. If a stranger had walked in without context, they would have seen an established family and a single woman on the other side, trying not to show how hard her hands were shaking. That was exactly the image they wanted. Dylan testified first. He spoke about mistakes, recovery, humility, and growth. He said he had been too broken 10 years ago to care for Noah, but had spent every year since becoming the man his son deserved. Caroline testified next and described their home, their neighborhood, their plans, their routines, their commitment to offering Noah the structure and opportunities they claimed I could not. My mother said I had pushed them away for years. My father said I had confused Noah by encouraging him to think of me as more than an aunt. Every lie was delivered in that soft, careful courtroom tone people use when they think sounding calm will make them sound honest. Then it was my turn. Rebecca did not ask me to perform. She asked me to tell the truth. So I did. I talked about the night Noah arrived. I talked about buying formula with borrowed money and turning a dresser drawer into a bed. I talked about the first fever, the first haircut, the first day of kindergarten, the nightmares, the soccer games, the science fairs, the lunches packed before dawn, the speech practice homework spread across our kitchen table, the way Noah still came looking for me when he was hurt or scared or proud or happy. I did not call myself a hero. Mothers who are telling the truth do not need hero language. We only need details. Rebecca then called Noah's therapist and two of his teachers, and each one in their own professional way said what Dylan's side had spent months trying to erase. Noah was thriving with me. He was attached to me as his primary parent. Disrupting that bond would not heal an old wound. It would create a new one. Then Rebecca stood, asked permission to submit the sealed evidentiary packet, and handed it to the judge. I will never forget the shift in that room. It did not happen with shouting. It happened with silence. The judge turned page after page, and her expression changed from patience to concern to something much harder. She looked up at Rebecca, then at Dylan, then at my parents. Finally, she asked the question that made the entire courtroom seem to stop breathing. Do they even know what you have? I said yes. I did not trust myself to say anything more. The judge read enough into the record to shatter the image Dylan had built. She cited his undisclosed gambling debt. She cited communications proving my parents had been in ongoing contact with him for years, while presenting themselves as newly informed. She cited messages discussing strategy for repositioning Noah emotionally and publicly. She cited Caroline's references to Noah as the missing piece, and the timing that suggested this custody action was tied not simply to remorse, but to financial and reputational incentives. By the time she finished, the room felt stripped bare. Dylan's lawyer looked like he wanted the floor to open. Caroline stopped making eye contact with anyone. My mother started crying quietly, which would have moved me once. It did not move me then. The judge's ruling was direct. Dylan's petition for primary custody was denied in full. My existing guardianship and parental authority remained intact. Any future contact would be limited, supervised, and contingent on further review, full transparency, and demonstrated regard for Noah's emotional welfare rather than adult convenience. She also made it clear that the court took false or misleading statements with the utmost seriousness and that portions of the evidence could be referred for additional review. My father did not look at me when that was said. Neither did my mother. When I walked out of the courthouse later that afternoon, Noah was waiting with Mrs. Delaney in the shade near the front steps, because I could not bear for him to sit through the hearing itself. The moment he saw my face, he started running. He reached me breathless and asked the only question that mattered. "Do I still get to come home with you?" I dropped to my knees, held both sides of his face, and told him yes. "Yes, you do." His whole body sagged with relief before he threw his arms around my neck so tightly I could barely breathe. On the drive home, he fell asleep in the back seat with his hand still wrapped around the edge of my sleeve. In the weeks that followed, the rest collapsed the way hollow things always do. Caroline separated herself from Dylan as soon as it became clear the court had seen through them. My parents tried to explain, then justify, then minimize. And when none of that worked, they asked for forgiveness as if that were a door they could still open on command. I did not slam that door for revenge. I closed it because Noah deserved peace more than they deserved access. That was the lesson I carried from everything that happened. Family is not a title that can be reclaimed when it becomes convenient. Parenthood is not biology waiting around to be rewarded later. Children are not props for damaged adults to use in order to repair their image, secure comfort, or rewrite the past. Love is a daily act. Safety is a daily act. Staying is a daily act. And sometimes the most important thing you can teach a child is that loyalty should never mean accepting manipulation from people who share your blood. A few months later, on Noah's 11th birthday, he handed me a card he had made himself. On the front, he had drawn the two of us standing in front of our little house with the windows glowing yellow. Inside he wrote, "You are my real mom because you stayed." I kept that card in the same drawer where I once kept guardianship papers and emergency receipts. It remains the clearest definition of family I have ever known.